Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm so excited for because I'm going to be recommending books featuring my two favorite things, fantasy and romance. Personally speaking, I feel like I'm always on the quest for the perfect book that features these two things in like different amounts, either a classic fantasy novel that has an incredible subplot line of romance or a romantasy story that has a well-paced romance and a compelling fantasy plotline. Today I'm going to be recommending books that sort of run across this spectrum of romance and fantasy that I all think are fantastic pickups and books I would recommend fully because let's be honest, there are a lot of duds out there. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. The first fantasy book with romance category is going to be a story that has a very central romantic plotline, but also has like vibey lyrical writing and also a truly incredible fantasy plotline as well. I would sort of describe it as like a 50-50 experience. The first book I have to recommend is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This is a YA duology that I feel like more people need to be picking up and reading. Do not be put off by the fact that this is YA because this is simply one of the most beautiful, romantic, heartbreaking, stunning series I simply have ever read. This is a dual perspective story and we're following two main characters that sort of come crashing into each other's lives. The first main character is named Laszlo, and Laszlo is a librarian and he spends his days gathering books for various researchers that live in his city. But he spends his night sort of pursuing his passion project, which is researching this place called the City of Weep. The City of Weep is almost like mythical at this point. It's been completely erased from history books and like common knowledge, and the name itself has also been completely lost, hence the name City of Weep. Laszlo himself dreams of visiting there one day, so needless to say, he was very surprised when an envoy from this city arrives in his town, sort of collecting various masters from all sorts of different trades to help them with a very specific problem, and they select Laszlo to travel alongside a bunch of other people given his knowledge of the city. From there, we watch Laszlo as he settles into this new place and sort of gets involved in the reality of this town. This story is incredible. Again, the writing style, stunning. The character perspectives, amazing. There's a whole other storyline following our other main character that I feel like it's just best to pick up this book and experience it for itself. This is a story about like second chances, community healing, community trauma, magic, so many shades of other things as well, personal ambition, love. It's just like, it is truly one of my favorite duologies of all time, and just like everything that Laini Taylor was able to accomplish in this, stunning. And the romance in this, I mean, it's one for the ages. It will absolutely rip your heart apart. It is so good. The next book I have to recommend is Where the Dark Stands Still. This is actually another YA fantasy series. I know, unusual, but honestly, there are some serious bangers within this category. And this is a folklore-inspired story that I would honestly describe as like a mix between Howl's Moving Castle and Uprooted. It follows our main character, Liska, who has been taught her entire life that magic is evil. Anyone who has magical abilities is monstrous. So Liska has been spending most of her life trying to get rid of her magical powers, and at the beginning of this book she is so desperate that she is actually venturing into this dark, dangerous magical forest in hopes of finding this flower that she can use to get rid of her magic finally. However, though, upon finding this flower, she also finds our other main character, who is the demon of the wood, and they make a deal together. Now our main character Liska has to live in this forest for 1 year inside this demon's home, like help him around his house basically, and also work to sort of uncover and understand her magic. And at the end of this, she is able to gain access to this flower. This book is just honestly so good. First and foremost, the vibes and writing style is definitely there. The folklore inspiration absolutely shines. I also love how like unexpectedly domestic this book is, which is kind of why I compare it to Howl's Moving Castle, because Liska is now just like moved into this like strange magical home that's alive and has its own personality. Not to mention, the demon of the house is quite, let's just say, very Howl-coded, if you know what I mean. The unpacking and discovering of Liska's powers, and also her sort of confronting elements of her own life and journey, are also really beautiful. And the romance that's centered in this is very nuanced and complex, and I really appreciated it, especially in the sort of unexpected way that the plot sort of turns out too. I found it to be like very rewarding, very emotional, and I loved this book. And the last book that sort of fits within the vibes category with a 50-50 fantasy plotline and romantic plotline is Thornhedge by T. Kinfisher. This is a short book that honestly packs quite the punch. It's also a weird little story that I adore. I would also say sort of leans a little bit cozy, so if you're wanting a pick-me-up, this is a great book to check out. It's T. Kinfisher's reimagining of Sleeping Beauty, and it is weird, but it works so well. Basically, we're introduced to our main character, Toadling, and Toadling has been like a creature of the forest for a very long time. He's also had this responsibility of like sort of keeping this one tower hidden, and she's surrounded it with all different types of magic to keep humans out of it, because inside there is this beautiful sleeping maiden that is becoming a fixture of some various tales around town. This maiden is no young woman, but in fact like a fae monster. At the beginning of the story, Toadling comes across a knight in the forest looking to go to this tower, and they begin to kind of share stories and get to know each other. We also begin to learn more about Toadling's past, all the different fae elements that make up this story. This is such a highly original sort of repainting of this well-known fairy tale. It also is so endearing, and the character connections that T. Kinfisher is able to create in not a lot of time and space is just honestly impressive. I loved Toadling. I loved the special and like very endearing relationship she began to foster with this knight character. I loved the centering of family and second chances and making a new life for yourself. And all of this is sort of happening on this very strange fairy tale fae stage, and it works so well. I loved Thornhedge so much. Next up, we have a true romantasy category, and I have 4 books to chat about today. The first 2 are by the same author, and by far the romantasy author I would recommend to anyone and everyone who's interested in that genre, and that is Grace Draven. And that is the Fallen Empire series by Grace Draven. I read the first 2 books in this romantasy series this year and loved them. They delivered everything I could have wanted in romantasy. Slow burn, well-paced, angsty, emotional, heart-wrenching romance, an interesting fantasy setting and plotline that wasn't necessarily like mind-boggling, but like was coherent and comprehensive, and also informed the romantic plotline. It had all the yearning of what you typically find in like historical romance novels, which I really love, but it all played out within a fantasy landscape and story, and it was just like chef's kiss. So good. Again, I read 2 books in this series. Each book sort of centers a new main character and couple, but again, the stories are sort of interconnected by this larger fantasy plotline. First book is Phoenix Unbound, and this I would describe as like an enemies to lovers romance story. We follow our 2 main characters that find themselves captive by this like evil empire at the beginning of this book, and they sort of work with each other to escape this prison. But then one of the characters kidnaps the other to help him basically get back to his people and his homeland, which obviously creates a lot of tension between these 2 characters. Our female main character is a fire witch who has magic that she's been hiding most of her life, and also has a lot of responsibility to her community, and our other main character is like a lost prince. So they both have very complicated backgrounds. They're both obviously in a very traumatic and dangerous situation together, and you see them not only get to know each other, but sort of like rediscover their own lives and like what they want from the world, and it's so good. And it's like true enemies to lovers, the back and forth and the drama of it all. I could not put this book down. I read it in one day. And then I obviously also picked up the next book in this series, which is called The Dragon Unleashed. And in this book, we're following a young woman who is like a medicinal trader woman. She kind of moves from place to place with her community, and one day she kind of stumbles upon this very strange man who is actually like a dragon in hiding. He's taken the form of a human, and he's being hunted by other individuals who like want to take his power and abilities for themselves. They again strike up this very like unlikely relationship, and the drama and the magic that ensues from there is so good. There's such good communication between the characters in this series. There's just a lot of thoughtfulness, like they're steamy, but there's also yearning, and I just feel like Grace Draven paces out her romances so well. By far my favorite romantasies I've read this year, and honestly that I've read in a while. Grace Draven is like an auto-read author for me at the moment. Another romantasy novel I would recommend is actually a very recent read for me, and that is A Dark and Drowning Tide by Alison Saft. This is a sapphic, fae, academic rivals to lovers that also really centers a lot of fantastic yearning. The story is set basically in a fantasy world that kind of gives like 1800s vibes. We follow two main characters that have the same advisor and are kind of always at odds with each other. Our first main character is Lorelei, and she is a very gifted academic and really dreams of becoming a naturalist one day. However, though, she also comes from a religious and cultural group that is very much ostracized by society society at large. So she consistently finds herself in situations where she's othered, and that has stayed true even throughout her academic career. And the other character we follow is Sylvia, who Lorelai hates. She is her like academic partner. Lorelai feels that she's like everything that she's not. She's flighty, artistic, over the top, very whimsical and things like that, but she's also a very powerful magic user and is part of this like circle of like very wealthy, powerful academics within this empire that are all connected to the emperor. At the beginning of this book, Lorelai and Sylvia, as well as some other characters, are about to set out on an expedition to find this like fairy pool that can grant like significant power to anyone who utilizes it. But right at the beginning of the journey, their beloved mentor is killed, and this story sort of shifts to a murder mystery quest story. It definitely has a few different plot lines going on. I would still say the primary plot line is the romantic character plotline between Sylvia and Lorelai. They're sort of back and forth, the miscommunication, the tension, the yearning. Living in Lorelai's head in this book is like honestly quite a bit of fun because she is so sure that she hates Sylvia so much, but you can clearly see as the reader that dang, she is actually just obsessed with Sylvia so much. Having that layer of dramatic irony makes this book quite a bit of fun. There's some like classic scenes and elements that the author includes. And then alongside the romance, there are two rather intriguing plot lines too. Obviously, we have this like whodunit murder mystery where Lorelai has to figure out what in the world happened. Still on this quest trying to find this like fairy pool that has untold power and abilities. So there's like magical obstacles, personal obstacles, and like interpersonal drama between a whole host of characters. So there's lots of things to like entertain you with, but I do think the star of the show is the sapphic romance that the author creates with this. That I would say was my favorite element of this book overall. Then the last romantasy book I'm going to recommend is The Spell Shop by Sarah Beth Durst. This is a cozy, low spice romantasy story. I sort of have books that range the gamut. Grace Draven's are definitely the steamiest, and then the Alison Saff book, and then lastly this book. This is a very endearing and adorable story that will absolutely like transport you. That is perfect if you're looking for kind of a light, easier read or like a palate cleanser book. This is a story following our main character Kiella, and Kiella is a librarian and very much an introvert. She spends her days and nights sort of just working in the library and not really interacting with other people. The only person she really talks to is her talking plant assistant. However, though, at the beginning of the story, the city that she lives in sort of has like revolution. So she is forced to flee in the night with as many books as she can carry, and she goes back to her hometown, which is on this like faraway remote island. And from there, we watch her as she begins to fix up her parents' old home and kind of settle in and make a life for herself within this community, and also have to deal with her very adorable, very charismatic and outgoing, handsome neighbor who's constantly wanting to help her and talk to her and not really realizing the fact that our main character is such an introvert. I honestly describe this book as kind of a farm sim within a story. Like a lot of it is watching Kiella like clean her house, go into the forest, collect berries, make jam, make friendships in town. Like it's like a very comforting structure to the book, and the scope of the book is like quite small to this island. There are definitely like a few dramatic plot lines, but all of them are like very manageable. So nothing is gonna really stress you out too much while reading this book. I just found it to be like a really cute, fun time. It delivered exactly what I was hoping, and I would read like so many other books with like this structure. It was like a Hallmark fantasy novel, and I loved it. And the last category I'm going to feature in this video are traditional fantasy novels with a romantic subplot line. These books are like classic adventure, action-based fantasy stories that I think also have as like a bonus, a really fun romance that like it doesn't need, but just adds to the overall reading experience, if you know what I mean. And the first book that fits into that category is The Book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence. If you are looking for a magical library story, look no further. This is one of my favorite versions of that is currently being published. This is a story that follows our two main characters. First is a girl who grew up in an area called the Dust, which is a very dangerous and desolate place outside of like this major walled city. However, though, after her community was attacked by monsters, she was forced to flee to this city, and there she was able to achieve getting a job of being like a librarian apprentice. From there, we watch her sort of have to work in this new place and traverse this massive magical library on a daily basis. And I really cannot emphasize enough like how all-consuming this library is. Like the library feels like a character within this story too, and I love it. The other main character we follow is a young man who has grown up trapped in this library chamber with his siblings. All of his siblings are sort of unusual and everyone has like a specific ability. They obviously have a complicated relationship where they're all close because they're really the only ones they can even talk to, but obviously day-to-day life can be a little stressful, a little boring, and then these two characters sort of unexpectedly come like crashing into each other's lives. This story combines element of a mystery, again, this magical library that sort of centers the core of this book, but obviously the relationships as it relates to this story are so interesting and are very important to the plot. I definitely don't want to say too much about this because I feel like going in and sort of unpacking and trying to follow everything that's happening over the course of this book is part of the reason as to why this book is just so good. But the writing style, the concept, the setting, the twists and turns, like everything about this is so engaging. And if you're looking for a book with a really great fantasy plot line, with a really interesting like subplot line of romance, this is it. Another book that fits in that category is The Ninth Reign by Jen Williams. This series truly has it all. And I mean that in the best way possible. Like, I don't know how this author is able to combine so many different like fantasy tropes and elements and make it work in such a compelling way, but the author is very successful in that with this series. This series is set in a fantasy world where once there was this great conflict between the people living in this land and these sort of like hive mind creatures that would invade them. However, though, it's been a very long time since the last conflict, and the carcasses of these like hive mind monsters sort of litter the land of this fantasy landscape. In this book, we're introduced to our three primary main characters that begin to travel with one another. The first is Vintage, who is kind of an archaeologist and researcher who's very fascinated with these artifacts of this long ago conflict. She travels alongside our other main character, Tor, who I would sort of describe as like a vampire-esque character in this fantasy world. And his people have been dealing with like an illness for a long time, so he has decided he's going to set out into the wide world and travel with Vintage. And then our last main character is a witch character. She herself is escaping a very dark past. First and foremost, the character dynamics between our sort of primary main characters is amazing. The endearing friendships that begin to form, the romantic subplot line that begins to form, and just like all of the different facets of these relationships are amazing. I loved the character work of this series so much. Not only are the characters like immediately likable and compelling, they also all have a very like rich inner narrative too, which I always enjoy reading from. That combined with such a cool fantasy plotline. This is sort of like a quest plotline. But as you're sort of going on this quest with our main characters in book one, something much larger is beginning to build behind the scenes, and you sort of read the consequences of that throughout the rest of the books within this trilogy. But like the fantasy world is so interesting and weird. Just the different things that this author is able to combine to create this narrative is so good. If you want a very riveting, fast-paced plot that has a quest element and all different types of intrigue with great characters you will fall in love with, friendship dynamics, romantic dynamics, like so many things to enjoy, this series is great. And the last book I'm going to recommend that kind of falls in that traditional fantasy space is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. I recently reread this series and completely got caught up, and honestly, I'm obsessed with this. This series is so unbelievably original, and every book that has been released so far has a very distinct voice and plot and stylization. But I will also say that one of the best parts about this series, alongside the truly unpredictable, strange plot lines that you will experience, are, again, the character dynamics that I love so much. And romance and love is a big part of that storyline that really is like a driving force to the narrative overall. This is kind of a necromancers in space story. I'm going to describe the first book, which is Gideon the Ninth, but understand that so much sort of devolves and goes into so many different directions over the course of the next two books in this series, and it's just such a wild ride. But Gideon the Ninth introduces us to our main character and narrator of book one, who is Gideon. And Gideon has grown up on this planet called Ninth House, which is like a very rundown planet that has a very specific religion, and she's been trying to escape this planet her entire life. But she has been stopped by doing this by her arch nemesis, our other main character, Harrow. And Harrow is a really powerful necromancer. At the beginning of book one, Harrow is given this invitation to travel to this place called First House to participate in this competition to become like a powerful political figure in the universe at large. But she needs like a companion who is good at sword fighting. Enter in Gideon. And despite absolutely hating each other, they decide to make a deal. If Gideon helps Haro become this powerful figure, she will get her freedom. From there, we watch these two figures as they travel to First House and sort of get involved in this competition. But again, the story really takes a sharp left turn and almost turns into like a whodunit murder mystery story. There are so many other characters you meet over the course of book one, and the conspiracy and the plot of this series like really goes in so many unexpected directions. Book one is really campy, really fun, hilarious narrator. Things sort of take a turn over the course of the next couple books in the series. I've loved them all for different reasons. It's just so unique and amazing. And again, love is actually quite important to this plot line, I would say. And the connections between characters are so fascinating to see, and I adore it so much. Alrighty guys, those are fantasy books that also have fantastic romantic plot lines, large and small. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye!